Hello, my name is Scott Marchand. I'm the Executive Director at the Pima Air Space Museum here in Tucson, Arizona. So the Pima Air Space Museum is all about the preservation, presentation, and interpretation of aerospace history. We cover it all from the earliest era to the modern times and into the future. We were chartered in 1966 and we opened for business in 1976, in May of 1976, just ahead of the bicentennial celebrations, and we've been going ever since. We started with 48 aircraft on small acreage of developed land here, and we are now currently in excess of 430 airframes on about 90 acres of display territory. Well, the museum's most prized possession is, that's a really subjective question because everybody's going to have a different answer on that one. As you might imagine, you know, things like aircraft and boats and cars and all sorts of things that are mechanical, they inspire an awful lot of emotion with people, and they create a strong bond and a strong connection. And everybody has their own personal reasons for favoring something. Usually it's related to relatives or a personal experience with a certain type of machine, airplanes here. I would have to say probably our most important aircraft is our Boeing B-52A Stratofortress. And the reason it's important to us is it is a real significant history maker in the mid-20th century. It was the mothership for the X-15 rocket plane program. This aircraft, the X-15, still holds absolute speed records for powered flight, conventional powered flight in excess of Mach 4. Almost all of the astronauts that were famous in the 60s in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program, most of them participated in the X-15 program, and many of them dropped off of our airplane during these test flights. It is also the oldest B-52 in existence. It's the third one built. It's got the lowest number of airframe hours, and we've been fortunate to have it here on display since the early 1980s. Well, so I think one thing that's significant about the Pima Air Space Museum, it is the largest and most diverse aerospace collection in the world. Well, let me qualify that. It's the largest and most diverse aerospace collection in the world that it's not a government organization. There are bigger, not many. There are a few that are more diverse, but not many. I mean, really, our only real parallel is one of our great partners is the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., which also has a broad representation of all eras and all types of aerospace vehicles. And we very much follow their lead in that. But they, of course, have the resources of the U.S. government behind them. We do not. So we're very proud of what we've been able to accomplish, and we owe a great debt of thanks to all of our loan partners, you know, the United States Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Smithsonian, NASA, and on and on. Like all of these type of things, it's not something that any one person can do on their own. It's a partnership now that's going back generations. So one question we always get is why Tucson and why so many airplanes? And they're two good questions. The one reason we are in Tucson is because of the existence of the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group, which is more generally known as the Boneyard to people who are into airplanes. So this is the world's largest aircraft storage, regeneration, maintenance facility in the world. It is devoted entirely to U.S. military aircraft, and it is literally right across the street from us. So in many respects, we are the stepchild, the grandchild, the offspring of this facility. Shortly after World War II, the facility was established here in Tucson at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, and it was primarily set up to accommodate large inventories of surplus aircraft that the U.S. had decided had future usability. B-29s, Corsairs, a lot of Navy stuff, a lot of Air Force stuff. Things like B-17s and B-24s had all been retired, and they were scrapped out in northern Arizona, primarily in the Kingman area. And the reason Tucson was selected are not for the obvious things that people think. I mean, the weather, the dry conditions are certainly optimal for storing airplanes, but the real reason is the ground conditions. The basin in the Tucson area is an old lake basin, and the ground conditions here are fairly unique. The soil is a very high clay, high calcium soil, impregnated with a substance that is locally called caliche, but it's really just calcium carbonate. So what happens is when the soil sets up dry, it's really literally as hard as concrete. Anybody who's tried to plant, do any gardening here in town knows that. But what that means for aircraft storage is you can put aircraft anywhere that you can get a ground anchor into. So what they use is these big sort of 3-foot long screws, like a tent post spike, and they go into the ground, cables come up and they tie off to the airplanes at their engineered spots. Now, if you're trying to do this in many other places, you'd have to have a huge paved area, either concrete or asphalt. It's expensive, it has maintenance issues, and every airplane ties down slightly differently, so it'd be almost impossible to predict what you could do with these things. So out here, the ground gave the Air Force versatility. Additionally, the dry conditions were very optimal. It's great for preserving the airframes and the systems, not so great for rubber and hoses. And we're kind of out of the way. Tucson in the 40s and 50s and until comparatively recently was a small community. So, it was a little bit isolated and allowed the military to do things without a whole lot of eyeballs on them. What happened here with us is we ended up, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, there had been an awful lot of aircraft scrapped out, but the staff over at what was called MASDC at the time were saving 1 or 2 each of the interesting aircraft. A lot of them were aviators or they had World War II service, so they were very fond of these aircraft. And about 1960-61, there was about 45 of these aircraft parked along Golf Links Road, and this was called Celebrity Row. And what happened is a delegation from the Pentagon and Inspector General Department came through and told the guys, okay, you've had your fun, these things need to disappear. There was a bit of resistance to that, and the commander at the time, H.R. Perkins, contacted some of the local civic authorities here, some business leaders, political leaders, and said, hey, we've got history already here, and it would be a shame to lose it. So they proposed spinning off to a public air museum foundation in the early 1960s, and the Pentagon agreed to that, and we were chartered in 1966. It took us about 10 years to get things going, and we've never looked back. Another thing that's really great about this area is the weather. The geology is stable, there's no earthquakes, we don't get anything like tornadoes or severe weather events. We do get summer thunderstorms that can be fairly aggressive, but they're largely localized. So when you put that all together, that's what makes Tucson one of the best places in the world to store aircraft indefinitely. While everybody has their own favorite airplane, probably without question one of the most popular aircraft in the collection is the SR-71 Blackbird behind me here. Designed and built by Kelly Johnson at Lockheed in the famous Skunk Works in the 1950s for high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance of the Soviet Union. The SR-71 capable of cruising at an altitude of 85,000 feet. Its top speed was a little bit under 2,200 miles an hour, so Mach 3 plus, and had a range of about 3,200 miles without refueling. They were capable of aerial refueling, and they could basically fly indefinitely as long as they could get gas. The engines were very thirsty. The airplane, as many of you know, is famous for having its all titanium fuselage. Titanium was used because of its high strength, low weight, and resistance to friction. On the ground, the SR-71 was famous for leaking fuel. As it got to altitude and gained speed, the friction and the heat from altitude caused the airplane to expand several inches and seal up all its onboard fuel tanks. Our particular SR-71 was converted on the assembly line from an A-12 version to an SR-71 and was one of the first ones in service. It was also one of the first ones to leave service, and it arrived here at the museum in 1991. So, of the 425 plus aircraft we have here in the collection, every single one of them has a story. Some are pretty mundane and some are pretty exceptional. And this is one of the more exceptional ones. This is our ORBIS DC-10 Flying Eye Hospital. It retired here several years ago from the ORBIS Foundation as they upgraded to a newer MD-10. And they were very considerate and donated the aircraft to us. And we flew it into the base across the street here and pulled it across the road, and it's been on display ever since. We try to do regular interior tours of the aircraft because it's really fascinating. They've left it basically as they used it. And the mission for the ORBIS was to fly around the world to less developed countries and assist in training local doctors in modern eye surgery techniques. The aircraft inside has a fully equipped surgical suite that allowed the ORBIS team to bring teams of local doctors and waves of patients that needed, you know, things that are minor surgeries for us here in this country, but in other places are harder to get access to. Cataract surgeries, lens replacements, dealing with corneal abrasions and things like that. So it's a really important mission, a really important story, and we're really pleased to be partners with ORBIS. Now, an aspect of this, as with most airplanes, is they have several lives beyond their original designed intended purpose, whether it's a military aircraft, a commercial aircraft, an experimental aircraft, or even a civil aircraft. They often evolve into different types of missions. Spread out around me here are several retired civilian and military types that were used for aerial firefighting. A vital service that's really important out here in the West. As we know, every summer there's terrible fire seasons. Aerial firefighting is an instrumental component to saving lives and saving property. We also have Coast Guard aircraft that were repurposed from executive jets. We have all sorts of NASA aircraft that were repurposed from refuelers or from other biz jets type of things to do things like zero gravity training and the like. So most aircraft, if you're clever and enterprising, can live for decades beyond their intended original purpose. So in addition to the 90 or so acres of outdoor display, we have close to 250,000 square feet of indoor display space spread across 6 different hangars. Most of our hangars host earlier, rare historic aircraft, primarily from the World War II era, but also up to the modern age. In this particular building, Hangar 5 here, it's heavily themed towards the air war in the South Pacific during World War II. So we have a number of rare and exceptional aircraft from that campaign. The consolidated privateer behind me is the only one in existence in its full military configuration from World War II. It's a late war modification of the consolidated B-24 Liberator, and it was intended for long-range anti-shipping, coastal interdiction, and maritime reconnaissance. And our aircraft spent several weeks right at the tail end of World War II flying from northern Alaska over the northern islands of Japan on anti-shipping strikes. We also have a lot of aircraft that were recovered from the jungles of New Guinea in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. These are all combat veterans, which is, of course, one of these things. It's part of the pedigree that aviation museums like to have with their military aircraft is combat history with them. A really interesting one for us is our P-40E. This was recovered from Taji in New Guinea in the 1970s and has been restored to its configuration now from about 5 different aircraft. So it's not the exact aircraft that was recovered, as there were so many different parts and components and pieces. So we've elected to paint it up to represent the markings that a local Tucsonan, Sidney Woods, flew when he was assigned to that theater. He was later on an ace in Europe, but he was a pre-war U of A student and one of the Wildcats' first quarterbacks. So he died in the 1980s from cancer, but was heavily connected to the community for a very long time. So we thought that was an appropriate tribute. There's a fairly standard process for most of the aircraft we do in the hangars. There's always exceptions, but largely what we do here is very similar to automotive or fleet refinishing. The biggest part of our work is keeping the aircraft looking good for display. It's a challenge because we're always adding aircraft, and the longer things stay outside, the harder it is on paint here in the Arizona desert. So it's a continuous, never-ending cycle of paint stripping, sanding, prepping, priming, refinishing, and with good planning and good prep and good paints, we typically will get 20 to 25 years out of a paint cycle, less for a variety of reasons. So that's largely what our staff are involved in. We've got 6 full-time staff here and anywhere from a dozen to 24 volunteers depending on the time of year. The volunteers do a lot of work outside with keeping the aircraft looking good on display, airing up tires, checking tie downs, painting out canopies, reassembling things, taking things apart. We do everything from heavy structural restoration for a lot of our World War II aircraft, fabric and reconstruction for earlier civil type of aircraft, and massive paint jobs on things like Super Guppies and 747s, so everything in between. All right, so big thank you to all for watching the video, and a huge thanks to the Peterson Automotive Museum for inviting us to participate in the channel. We look forward to great things in the future.